Lansky and Vivian Wyman to NLTV.
Well, I should probably introduce myself by saying I'm 65 years old. I was born in the States. I, grew up like most American Jews did, in that my grandparents came from the old country, from Eastern Europe. And Yiddish was their first language, but of course, no one ever spoke the language with me or with anyone else my age. It was, as the Eneklach so nicht verstehen, when the grandkids weren't supposed to understand, that's when you heard the language. I see Vivian shaking his head in recognition of that. And so, and I think they're not so terribly different in England as well. Yeah. But it was really when I went off to college that began to change. I went to a school called Hampshire College, a small experimental school. My very first semester, wholly by accident, I took a course on the Nazi Holocaust, one of the first times the Holocaust been taught in a university context in the States. And by the end of that semester, I was much less interested in the Holocaust per se. How did the Germans go about killing the Jews of Europe? And far more interested in who were these Jews of Europe, which was a subject still largely left out of the Jewish studies curriculum at that time. The field was called Judaic Studies at the time. And so I was really lucky that a faculty advisor for the course was an anthropologist, which meant that he asked all the right questions. So I went to him and said, I want to learn more about Jewish history. And he said, well, okay, go to the library, check out a lot of books, start reading, and we'll talk. So my undergraduate education really unfolded at his kitchen table. Wow. Talking with this. Eventually I went on to graduate school at McGill University in Montreal. And I loved it all. It was fascinating. I was studying modern Yiddish literature. I would have gone on, I think, for a conventional academic career, except for one basic problem. There were no books to read. Yiddish as a literature, as we know it, is pretty modern. It doesn't even begin till the 1860s, 1870s, really picks up steam in the 20th century. And it was a literature by which Jews try to figure out what it meant to be Jewish in a modern world, and therefore it's spirited and funny and brilliant and disturbing and it's got all the virtues of great literature. And so I started studying, but I realized there were no books to read because of this fact that an older generation was passing on. The books were being thrown out by kids who didn't understand what it even was. And so I decided, well, first I met with experts in New York and explained what I wanted to do. And I said, so how many Yiddish books do you think are out there? And they said, well, after a lot of Jewish groups, there was a lot of debate, as you can imagine. And after all the debate, they said, we think there are about 70,000 volumes still extant and recoverable.
Wow.
So here we are 41 years later, and we have saved about 1.5 million volumes.
Yeah, wow.
Yiddish was far more central than anybody could have imagined.
Aaron, forgive me. You say 70,000 volumes and 1 million volumes. Do you mean volumes or titles?
No, I mean volumes. That was
actual physical volumes.
Yeah, although I have to tell you, Vivian, it was really interesting because the fact these were pretty, these were impressive scholars with whom I was speaking. And the fact they could have underestimated it so radically, from 1.5 million down to 70,000, I think bespeaks the sense of discouragement that pervaded that world at the time. I think they really felt, the war had come and gone. The Jews of Europe were largely murdered. There were 11 million Yiddish speakers before the war and 5.5 million of them afterwards. I mean, it was just such a gigantic disruption in the historical fabric that I think they just felt it was all over and the kids were never going to be interested in this. And, we had moved on. But in fact, as I say, far more Jewish homes, not just in the States, but all over the world, far more Jewish homes had Yiddish books in them. They had inherited from earlier generations, and Yiddish had just been so much more central to Jewish life than was ordinarily credited by that point.
What made you want to preserve all this? Is because of the Jewish history that was involved in it?
Yeah, I mean, I started studying Yiddish with pretty utilitarian goals. I mean, it was simply to be able to read primary sources. I just have to explain one really key thing first, though, because I think a lot of people hear the word Yiddish and they think of it as something quaint or nostalgic, or certainly a vestige of the past. But the truth is, Yiddish was spoken, the language has been around for about 1,000 years. And it was spoken by more Jews in more places for a longer period of time than any other Jewish language in history, including Hebrew. there are about 18 Jewish languages altogether. But Yiddish of all of those by far created the most, along with Hebrew, created the most extraordinary modern literature. And that's why this became so significant. So I was studying Jewish history, but I needed to handle primary sources. By that point, historiography generally was shifting. Up until then, historiography really had meant this, intellectual history, cultural history, religious history. But that was starting to shift in the broader world to social history, cultural history, how people actually live their lives. And once you started to look at that in a Jewish context, well, up until the Holocaust, 80% of the world's Jews were living their lives in Yiddish. And therefore, I didn't really understand how I could learn about them and understand their view of the world without understanding their language. So along with other languages, I started studying Yiddish. But somehow, what was that Marshall McLuhan line, the medium's the message, it started to rub off after a while. Like the more I studied it, the more I realized that it gave a window, not just to historical sources, but that it gave a window to a sensibility and a worldview that was kind of extraordinary and compelling, and that I was, somewhat familiar with from my grandparents and from all the old guys in Shul when I was growing up. But this was very, it was suddenly an immersion in a world I really barely knew existed. And even today, I'm speaking to you from our building in Amherst, Massachusetts. We're on a college campus here. And our building's beautiful and it kind of looks like a shtetl and it's 50,000 square feet, but we have, we had many people coming here as visitors before the pandemic began, and we're going to be reopening again in a few more weeks. But so we have thousands of people that come from all over the world. They walk into the building, they're on a balcony level, and they're looking out at what for them is like this sea of Yiddish books that we've collected. In fact, what they're looking at is 2% of our collection. The others are stored elsewhere, but they look at this and they're just staggered by this. They always say, who knew that such a world existed? They're always rather amazed at that phenomenon. But the truth is, it's only because it got ripped out of history that we've lost track of it. However, young people today are far more eager to reconnect than we've ever seen before. So the world is changing very fast, especially during the pandemic.
Sure.
So how many Yiddish speakers are there around today? And how do they divide between Haredim and the rest of us?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I don't think we know the exact number, but it's some millions that are still speaking the language. I mean, it's vastly reduced from what it once was. Among secular Jews or modern Jews, the numbers are relatively small. Among Lubavitch is pretty much giving up on Yiddish now. It's sort of over for them. Yeah. But by the way, Lubavitch itself was a Litvak movement, of course, a more rationalist movement. But in the South, all the other Hasidim, they're still speaking Yiddish as much as they ever did. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, I mean, their numbers are increasing so rapidly right now. The average family size in the States of a Hasidic family is 9 kids. So you don't have to do the arithmetic for very long to figure out that in a few generations, this is hugely significant. When I was a kid growing up, I never saw a Chassid. I didn't know such a thing existed. And yet, even though my grandparents had come from Hasidic families in Galicia, but now that's changed a great deal. A few years ago, the New York Times reported that 70% of all Jewish children in New York City are now either Orthodox or Haredi. I mean, that's an astonishing number. And the only way to explain it is demographic. If you have 9 kids, it grows really fast. And if the other families have none or 1 or 2, pretty soon the numbers really begin to diverge quite dramatically. So in actual terms, the number of Yiddish speakers in the world is growing very, very rapidly right now. But it's a sort of different sort of Yiddish, And I'll even add one more thing, Batya, because up until now, there was always a hostility towards Yiddish as a literature in the Hasidic world. Because, of course, it was weltlich, it was worldly. And that wasn't exactly high up on the Hasidic, hit parade. That wasn't what you were looking to do. So for them, these books were puzzle. It was treif. It was forbidden.
Growing up, I didn't even know it existed. Until later on. There was this whole.
Right, but the transformation now is that, we learned this from the OTD literature, the off the derech literature. You have that there too.
Have the phrase. Yes.
Literature of people who break away. And one thing, I've only read one of these books, but my kids have read a zillion of them. And one thing that becomes apparent from all of them is that many Hasidic homes now have computers for the first time. And it's because with that many kids, particularly if the fathers aren't working, you need to access the social welfare system in some way. And to get food stamps and relief, one needs a computer. So the computers have made their way into Hasidic homes to some degree. And the Hasidim are often using them surreptitiously to read Yiddish literature, which of course they can read very easily.
Right.
And so we've put our books online, and we've had about 5 million downloads. And estimates are that perhaps somewhere even close to half of those downloads have come out of the Haredi world where they're not supposed to be reading these books, but are doing it anyways. We like to say that what the Haskalah, what Jewish enlightenment couldn't accomplish in 200 years, the computers have taken care of in 2 years. So changes afoot, and where it'll go, God only knows, you know.
But you know, it's interesting also when you were doing your research, and you mentioned that you found personal stories, right, with each book. That when you were going to collect it, it wasn't just about picking up the boxes and leaving, right? So can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
This will come as a surprise to none of your viewers, but Jews like to talk. You know, we are a very talkative people, and also people rather, you know, generous with feeding people as well. So you know, over the years, so I'm 65 now. For 20 years of my life, when I first started the books, and I was 23, I was 24, I guess, when I started this. But at that point, I was heading out, you know, every week I would get into an old truck and we would drive down to New York or to Montreal or to other cities. And we would go door to door. People would call us in advance and schedule pickups for their Yiddish books. These were mostly elderly people who had no one to whom they called it their Yerusha, you know, their inheritance. And they had no one to whom they could bequeath it. So they called us up and, you know, would we please come and get the books? And no matter who they were and no matter where they were, it was always the same kind of ritual that took place. We'd walk into you know, I was with 2 or 3 other young people. We were all the same age. We were all pretty scruffy. We've been schlepping books all day long. So we're dirty and we have torn jeans and t-shirts and a lot of hair in those days. And, you know, we'd walk in and people were oblivious to that. They could have cared less. All they knew is that we were there and we were interested. They would speak with us in Yiddish. They would sit us down at the kitchen table. They would feed us an enormous meal. They would speak to us at length about the literature. And for me, that was as much of a gift as the books themselves. I mean, to understand the stories behind those books and what it meant to these people.
Wow, it's fascinating. I mean, you talk about how, you know, the Yiddish is now available on the internet, but I mean, we always had it on the screens, right? I mean, we had the random words of chutzpah, and you know, you always heard that the sometimes the curses too is always the first thing you learn, right? When you learn a language, but even, you know, I think now there's been a recent rise. I mean, we know, like even this with shtisel, right? I mean, the fact that Yiddish is so alive and well there. How would you account for that?
Well, those are 2 different questions, I think. But let me try to unravel that a tiny bit. Let's start with shtisel, okay? Shtisel is an Israeli TV series about not Hasidic exactly, but Haredi Jews. I think they're Litvak Misnagdim.
Yes.
Living in Jerusalem, and of course, the secret behind shtisel is that nobody in shtisel is actually a religious Jew, right? These are all Israeli, modern Israeli actors who act these roles. And it's actually, there've been a few films now that have done this as well. It's a little bit tricky because Hasidic Yiddish is not grammatical for the most part, because that's not what they study. They're not studying grammar and structures. This is just something they use in everyday life, and Hebrew is the Lashon Kodesh, the holy language. So the people who coach them in the Yiddish have to coach them in bad Yiddish. You know, in the Yiddish they would have approximated the speech. A few of the actors, I think just 2 of them actually knew Yiddish. The first Bubby, the Bubby dies, and then the actress died rather. The first Bubby, I think, was a survivor and was a fluent Yiddish speaker.
Right. You could hear that difference actually now that you mention it. Right. The second,
it's rich and
didn't have it as natural. You're right.
And actually, the guy who plays the uncle, the brother of the older shtisel.
Yeah, Nachum.
Yeah, he's from I
We're
haven't seen
very
his
big
brother.
fans here in our community about this.
Yeah, but
We had the director come and talk to us. Yeah, yeah.
right. So he's from a Jewish family in Baghdad, which was once a third
Mhm.
Jewish before the war, which is also astonishing. Anyway, so however, the show's been, I mean, most of it's in Hebrew, but part of it's in Yiddish. And it's been extraordinarily popular with just about everybody I know, and why? I guess it's because, well, first of all, because it's good acting and it's a good story. But I think more than that, I think it portrays a world that has its own authenticity, and its own integrity. And I think people in a modern world respond to that. They're intrigued by it. They're fascinated by it. Shira Haas was then in a different show, too. Another Hasidic.
Unorthodox.
Unorthodox. Right,
Yeah.
which is also very good.
Right.
Slightly less realistic, perhaps, but
Right.
but very good nonetheless. Yeah. So I think there's something there that we, people watch it from a distance, but they're fascinated by it. It's also a world that's pretty insular, so most Jews don't get a glimpse of it.
Mhm.
And
Right, absolutely.
we run a summer program and we teach Yiddish to college students. So for a number of years, we started bringing the kids down to a Hasidic neighborhood in Brooklyn to be exposed to, Yiddish in the wild there, Yiddish.
That's such an awesome trip. Oh my
Yeah,
God.
Yiddish in the
I must
real
be
world.
blown away by that.
So one day we sent the kids down and they're in a van, and there's one of our instructors was driving, and this guy is a young American guy who has an uncanny ability to learn languages, and he has a wonderful mimetic ability, and he just, match any accent. He's got it down completely. So he got lost. So he pulls over and he sees a few Hasidim standing on the side of the street there, and he says to the guy, he says, Rebbe, can maybe you can give me directions of wherever I'm going. And he said to me, he told me this later, he said, this Hasidic guy just stares at him. And for like a full minute, he just looks and looks and looks. And finally he says, you're Jewish, because for him, this was like light years away from their world. And I think they thought, like your parents, they thought Yiddish was a secret language, right? And of their own, and they were a little appalled that somebody else was in on it.
Wow.
However, we quickly learned that if we went into the stores and spent money, they were more than happy to talk to us, and they were as intrigued by us as we were by them. I don't want to get too far afield, only because.
But just a quick question on that. I mean, are your students Jewish? I mean, or you also have the non-Jewish, Gentiles ready to learn the language?
Everybody, I believe, is the answer to that question.
Really? Wow.
We never ask. You're not supposed to ask.
Right. Well, just out of curiosity, what would interest? I guess a linguist would want to know different languages.
Well, no, it's a lot of reasons, really. I mean, first of all, Jewish is complicated these days. I don't know what it is in the UK right now, but in the States, intermarriage outside of the Orthodox world is 70%.
Right.
So you got to just assume that, more than half the kids we see are going to have something pretty complicated going on there, right? And so.
I hear that. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So it's, in and of itself, but there are a great many non-Jews as well who just see this as a great world literature. We had one woman who they were still in touch with, a woman named Agnieszka Ilwicka. She was from Poland, from Wrocław. And she came to us for a summer as a student in our program, then spent the whole year with us working. And I think she even stayed for 2 years, if I'm not mistaken. She produced our podcast. She was funny and ebullient and great and smart, and her Yiddish was terrific and stuff. And so one day, kind of when it was time to leave, I asked I was writing a book and wanted to know if I could interview a few of the students. And I had a chance to ask the questions I wouldn't ordinarily have asked. So I said to her, so tell me, Agar, I said, why are you here? I said, is there something Jewish in your background with it? In Poland, a lot of Poles have Jewish ancestors. So no, nothing. And then she thought for a second. She says, well, come to think of it, my great, or something like that, uncle was one of the people who assassinated the Tsar Alexander II in 1881, which of course gave rise to mass Jewish exodus. And I said, Aga, that's fantastic. If it weren't for you, I probably wouldn't be here right now, because my family never would have left. So,
Wow.
So I don't know, history is complicated. I had a professor once, and he said, nobody could have invented Jewish history. It's way too improbable for that. And I would say that continues to be the case. So it's both Jews and non-Jews of all sorts of backgrounds. we once had a young guy who was there, same thing, a really, really good student, excellent Yiddish, spoke a number of other languages. And he came from a town called Lame Deer, Montana. You know, this is not exactly a metropolis, and the names,
Nothing there.
who knows what he, you know, why and what, but he had gone to Bard College, and here he was studying with us. And so at the end of the semester, at the end of the year, I asked him about his own background. He was very happy to speak about it. Turns out his father was Irish Catholic, but his mother was a Northern Cheyenne Indian. And he said he was born in California, but when he was very young, they took him to the reservation in Montana, and he grew up there. And he, I think it was Montana. Anyways, he grew up on the reservation, and he said it was really tough because he was, you know, half white and half Indian. There was a certain amount of prejudice, and the kids kind of ragged on him a lot. Then they tried to send him to the white school, and that was even worse, and he went back to the Indian school.
Oh,
But he said the education was pretty bad, and he just didn't know very much about the world. He said he had never met a Jew before or even knew anything about the whole phenomenon. But he said when they had a unit in high school on the Civil War, and that was the first time he learned about Black people and African-American experience in America. And then they did a unit on the Holocaust, totally acontextual, but they did discuss the existence of Jews, and he said he became very intrigued with this. As an outsider himself, this was of interest to him.
wow.
So he started reading modern Jewish literature, and he came upon Saul Bellow and Grace Paley, Ozzy Yezieski. I mean, you know, he discovered modern Jewish literature, and he was very taken with it. He went to school at Bard. They just was so happened there was a professor at Bard who had a doctorate in Yiddish literature, and she sort of took this young guy under her wing, and he learned Yiddish, and he's talented with languages, and he learned it very quickly.
Wow.
And then he went on, he did a graduate studies at the Central European University in Budapest, and he's gone on in the field, you know, so you couldn't put up of any of this, you know, and we just take it in stride now. It's so common at this point.
Right. Okay, just before we end, I know, Vivian, did you want to ask one more? Did you want to make one more point?
Yeah, how many secular people are there speaking Yiddish?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know, but far more than we thought. And Vivian, the best way I can answer the question, probably statistically, is by telling you who's actually reading, you know, the books and how many are being read. I mean, the fact that when we put the books online, this was maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago now, we had digitized everything. And then with help from Steven Spielberg and others, we were able to post them online through the Internet Archive in San Francisco. Now we work in a partnership with the National Library of Israel, the YIVO Institute, and the New York Public Library. We're doing something that's really been done in the Jewish world. We're all working together, and we're pooling our resources so that everything will become accessible through a single portal. There used to be an expression in the Yiddish world. They say, "Jeder macht Shabbos für sich." Everybody makes Shabbos by themselves. But we can't afford that anymore. It's too expensive. So we're doing it consortially instead. So we posted the books online, though, and we had no idea what kind of demand there was going to be. Like, we really didn't know anything. And the Internet Archive is a nonprofit group that hosts us. By principle, they don't track the users. They don't ask track any information about the users. So we didn't have that, but we knew which books were being downloaded. And so that gave us some insight. But what we knew even more were the number of downloads. At this point, it's probably crossed 5 million individual downloads. In other words, full-length books have been downloaded 5 million times.
Wow.
That's staggering. I mean, we never thought there were that many Yiddish speakers in the world who could even access this material. So the number has been dazzling. I have to tell you that I once was invited to give a lecture in New York. It was a keynote talk for a big citywide Yiddish festival. And I get there, and the person chairing the festival was Gennady Estreich, whom I had met many years before in the Soviet Union when he was a Soviet citizen working with Yiddish, and, you know, very much alone in Russia. And he had actually, I think he went to school in England, and then eventually came to the States and became the head of Jewish studies at New York University. And, you know, when I spoke to him years before, it had been in Yiddish. Now he had fluent English. And anyways, he got up to introduce me, and he said, "I have to tell you a secret." He said, when the Yiddish Book Center announced they were putting all of Yiddish literature online, he said, and that they were doing it for free, he said, my friends and I in the field, none of us believed it. He said, we thought you were just trying to hook us in and then you were going to put up a paywall and charge us for this. He said, so we all went out and we bought hard drives and downloaded as many books as we could before you put up the paywall. Well, obviously, there's still no paywall, but that could explain a few of those 5 million books.
So who's funding this? How is this being funded? And if you're saying you digitized this 10 years ago, so what's the plan for the future now?
Sure. Well, we've been at it now for 42 years.
Wow.
And when my mother was still alive, she used to ask that question too. How are you going to make a living? Who's funding this? You know, so I'm well familiar with the question. It started out in a very grassroots way. Most of the established Jewish organizations were rather contemptuous or disdainful of Yiddish at the time. I remember one executive, you know, sitting behind this enormous desk, and when I told them what we're doing, and I think we needed like $10,000 to, you know, collect books for a year at the time, and he said to me, I want you to know that we will never give you a penny for this project. Yiddish represents the part of Jewish life that we have worked very hard to forget.
Wow.
You know, immigrant experience, it was unwashed, it was indecorous. And he said, we will never give a cent to support that. He said, we'll give you a nice scholarship to go study in Israel, but no money to collect Yiddish books. So we had no choice but to go out and just do it in a grassroots sort of way. And that's exactly what we did. Today, we have about 20,000 members who support it. Our mailing list just increased by an additional 10,000 during the pandemic, because that's been like the most, I mean, it was an explosion of interest in Yiddish, you know, over the past year for a number of reasons, I think. So, and of course, we have a budget of about $7 million a year, and we have to raise it. I mean, I spend a lot of my time raising money and speaking with people and lecturing, but people have been wonderfully forthcoming with it. I mean, really, I don't hear that anymore, that, you know, hey, Yiddish is dead and we shouldn't be doing this, you know. Now I think there's a much broader understanding that people, if we want to know who we are, we don't have to study just Torah and text. We also need to understand who we are as a people and where we've been for the few thousand years since we left the land of Israel, you know, and since the days of the Bible. What have we been up to? And the truth is, we created an extraordinary culture in a number of different languages. But I say, you know, for the 3/4 of the world's Jews, and more of that took place in Yiddish, alongside Hebrew as a holy language. But Yiddish was a language of everyday life. And that story is more compelling today than it's ever been before. And I think in a increasingly multicultural world, it just stands to reason that Jewish kids want to understand themselves, who they are, where they come from, what they bring to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, all the Talmud is in Aramaic, right? I mean, that was
part of the Talmud. Yes, right. The Gemara. Yes, absolutely.
Right. And so like, you know, that's the language they were speaking, right? And so that was something that
was the vernacular. And actually, you know, it's interesting when we make the Passover Seder, the Haggadah is mostly in Hebrew.
That's right.
But the really important parts are still in Aramaic. So, you know, halach, manyo, you know, this is the bread of affliction. So why do we say that in Aramaic? Because it's the really big line of the Seder explaining the most critical thing. And you want it, 1,000 years ago, they wanted to make sure everybody was going to understand. So they said it in Aramaic instead of in Hebrew, so to make sure everybody would understand it. And today, of course, we use English that same way, but people had used Yiddish in the same way as well, or other Jewish vernaculars.
Right, absolutely. You know, back in Canada, when my husband used to give it, you know, because we were in Canada for, I guess, you know, before we came to London, and so when in front of the car before the Yizkor, he used to give his sermon in Yiddish.
Really?
Yes, he did.
Gosh.
Yes. Isn't that amazing? So because he knew that a lot of people there still had that language, you know, still were recognizing, you know, remembering the loved ones, and he would give his sermon in Yiddish. It was really amazing that he did that. But we want to thank you very much, Aaron, for joining us. Really, it's really been a fascinating story, and Yasher Koach on the amazing work, Shkoyach, like they say, right? Even though it's Hebrew,
Shkoyach is Yiddish.
But it's really Hebrew, Yasher Koach, right?
Yeah.
But roughly 20% of Yiddish comes from Hebrew.
Hebrew,
right.
yes.
Right.
I say in the Purim, the Purim is definitely Hebrew. So
Yeah, it's like Meshuggah is Hebrew, but it's
we could go on for hours.
Yeah.
Right.
I know we could.
But we'll have to talk another time sometime, because there's a whole other side to the story. You know, collecting books was the start.
Right.
Now we're not only digitizing, but we're training a whole new generation of translators to get these books out into English. 2%'s been translated so far. We're collecting oral histories around the world. We're teaching Yiddish. We just released a brand new Yiddish textbook that's taking the world by storm in the middle of a pandemic even. So there's a lot going on right now, but not just here, but everywhere. You know, the world's changing.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, just to let you mention translator, my dad, my father in Brooklyn is actually an official court interpreter and translator, and he does it for Yiddish. I mean, he does, when he goes to the, you know, family court, he's there translating in Yiddish. Mostly, that's most of his.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, I like that. That's good.
83 years old. He just went back to work now.
The length of the yard, and that's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. So wonderful. Well, thank you very much, and we'll put the website. It's
Bookcenter.org.
sorry, YiddishBookCenter.org. We'll have it.
And I have to clarify, Yiddish Book Center, but with an American spelling, CENTER.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
It's an American. I
But
will.
if you just Google Yiddish, you'll find us pretty quick too.
Yeah, yeah, really, really amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time and for the incredible work that you did back then and continue to do for the Jewish people and for the love for the language of Yiddish.
Thanks, Bucket. My pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm honored. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
It was nice to meet you.
You too. Bye now.
Bye.